Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going back in time to the period between 1815 and 1914, the century leading up to World War I.
It's a complex period,
Yeah,
but super important to understand if we want to grasp what led to the 20th century's most devastating conflict.
totally. So we've got a stack of sources on the major powers of that era. Countries like Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, even the Ottoman Empire, the U.S., and Japan.
Wow, that's a lot to cover.
It is. And I'm hoping you can help make sense of it all.
I'll do my best.
Awesome. So let's just jump right in. Let's start with the aftermath of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna in 1815. What were the great powers hoping to achieve, after decades of Napoleonic wars?
Well, the Congress of Vienna was all about restoring order and stability to Europe. The key players, Austria, Britain, Prussia, Russia, and France, they aimed to redraw the map, prevent future conflicts, and also contain the spread those pesky revolutionary ideas.
Sounds like a tall order. Who is the leading figure in all this?
The Austrian diplomat Clemens von Metternich played a pivotal role.
Oh, Metternich, yes.
He envisioned a concert of Europe. It was basically a system of collective security and diplomacy where the great powers would cooperate, to keep the peace, and importantly, to keep everything balanced.
So like an orchestra.
Exactly. He was like the conductor trying to make sure everyone played in harmony. His main focus was preserving the existing order and squashing any potential uprisings that might challenge the monarchies of Europe.
Interesting analogy. So Metternich's Concert of Europe, did it work? Was this system effective in preventing major conflicts?
Well, it did manage to maintain relative peace in Europe for a few decades.
Okay.
But underneath, the tensions were always there, particularly the rise of nationalism and this growing gap between the great powers. These eventually undermine the effectiveness of the concert.
Right. It's like trying to hold back the tide. So while Metternich was busy trying to maintain stability on the continent, Britain was already a global superpower. How did they approach international relations during this time?
Well, Britain at this point adopted a policy called splendid isolation.
Splendid isolation.
Yeah. It sounds like they were completely withdrawing, but that's not really it. It was more of a strategic choice. Avoid getting tangled up in those continental European conflicts while focusing on their global empire, their navy and their economic interests. They only intervened when absolutely necessary, when their vital interests were at stake.
So they were picking their battles. That's pretty smart. Was this approach successful?
Well, in the short term, yes. It allowed Britain to really expand its empire and stay on top as the world's leading power. But this policy also meant they were becoming more and more isolated diplomatically, which made it harder to manage the growing tensions in Europe as we got closer to the 20th century.
Makes sense. It's fascinating to see how different nations pursued different paths. Let's turn our attention to France. How did they navigate the post-Napoleonic era?
France had a much rougher time, to be honest.
I can imagine.
They went through a whole series of regime changes, political upheavals. It was a very unstable time. But despite all this, they still wanted to reclaim their status as a great power. This was especially true under Napoleon III, who came to power in 1852.
Napoleon III, right? The nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. What did he do? How did he change France's foreign policy?
Well, he wanted to restore French glory through military ventures and empire building. He got involved in the Crimean War against Russia and even tried to establish a French-backed empire in Mexico.
But
His most significant foreign policy blunder was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871.
the Franco-Prussian War. That was a major turning point, wasn't it?
Yes, for both France and Germany.
Right. Can you elaborate on the consequences?
So the war ended terribly for France. They lost Alsace and Lorraine, two provinces, to the newly unified German Empire. And on top of that, Napoleon III was deposed. That led to the establishment of the Third Republic. This defeat had a huge impact on French nationalism. It fueled a real desire for revenge, something that would have big consequences leading up to World War I.
So this defeat really set the stage for a new power dynamic in Europe.
Absolutely. The Franco-Prussian War marked the emergence of a unified Germany as the big dominant force in continental Europe. And this was largely thanks to Otto von Bismarck, the minister-president of Prussia, and probably one of the most skilled diplomats and strategists of the 19th century.
Yeah, Bismarck's role in German unification is, crucial. What were his key strategies? How did he manage to outmaneuver all the other European powers?
Well, Bismarck was a master of what's called realpolitik. It's a very pragmatic, sometimes ruthless approach to politics. He focused on power and national interest, not really on ideology or ethical, considerations. He knew military strength was important, but he also used diplomacy and made strategic alliances to get what he wanted.
Realpolitik, like the ends justify the means.
Exactly. Can you give us some examples of how he put us into action?
Sure. So Bismarck basically provoked a series of wars, very carefully planned, of course, against Denmark in 1864, Austria in 1866, and then France in 1870-71.
Wow.
Each of these wars was designed to weaken his rivals and consolidate Prussian power. And ultimately, it all led to the unification of Germany under Russian leadership in 1871.
And that changed everything. I mean, Bismarck's maneuverings completely altered the balance of power in Europe. What were the long-term consequences of German unification? Well, the creation of this powerful, ambitious German empire totally changed the European political scene. It disrupted the old balance of power and led to this complicated web of alliances and rivalries that would eventually, lead to World War I.
Right, right. So we've seen the decline of France and the rise of Germany. What about the other major players during this time? Let's talk about Russia. What role did they play?
Russia, well, they were this sprawling empire with huge resources and ambitions to match. They were key in the concert of Europe, often stepping in to protect their interests in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. They also expanded into Central Asia, even clashing with Britain in what was called the Great Game.
The Great Game sounds intense. Were there any big changes happening within Russia during this time?
Yes, under Tsar Alexander II, Russia went through some major reforms, most notably the abolition of serfdom in 1861.
Okay.
This was a huge social change, but it created new challenges too. Russia was trying to modernize its economy and political system. It wasn't easy.
So modernization was a big theme for many of these countries. Was Russia able to keep up with the rapid changes happening in Europe?
Not entirely. They did make strides in industrialization and developing their military, but they lagged behind powers like Britain and Germany. And this became really clear in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. It was a really humiliating defeat for Russia, one that exposed their vulnerabilities and added to the growing social unrest they were experiencing.
Ah, the Russo-Japanese War. That was a turning point too, wasn't it? It wasn't just a defeat for Russia. It showed the world that the established hierarchy of global power was shifting.
Exactly. It was a wake-up call not just for Russia, but for everyone.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. The Congress of Vienna, Britain's splendid isolation, France struggling after Napoleon, the rise of Germany with Bismarck, and Russia's challenges. It's amazing how these events are all connected.
And we're just getting started. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the declining Ottoman Empire, the rise of the United States, and how Japan transformed into a modern power.
I can't wait. So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll unravel more of this complicated and fascinating period in global history. We left off talking about Russia and their defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. It seemed like while some empires were gaining power, others were facing serious challenges.
Definitely.
So let's move on to the Ottoman Empire. They were often called the sick man of Europe during this time. What led to their decline?
Well, the Ottoman Empire, they were once a powerful force, but during the 19th century, they were hit with all these pressures, both from within and outside. Internally, nationalist movements were popping up in their territories.
So problems from within.
Exactly. Plus, their economy was stagnating, and their administration was, well, inefficient. All of this weakened their hold on power.
Right, I see. But what about those external pressures you mentioned?
Well, the European powers, they saw that the Ottomans were weakening, and they started taking advantage, encroaching on their territory. Russia especially wanted to expand its influence in the Balkans.
The Balkans. That's a historically volatile region, right?
Definitely. And Russia really wanted control of the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. Super strategically important.
It sounds like this competition for influence and territory must have caused some serious conflicts.
Oh, absolutely. Take the Crimean War, for example.
The Crimean War?
Yeah, from 1853 to 1856, Russia was fighting against an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire.
So the Ottomans had some allies.
Yes, and with their help, they managed to stop Russia from getting what they wanted. But the war also showed just how vulnerable the Ottomans were. Their military strength was declining.
So even with the win, it was a turning point for the Ottoman Empire. Did they try to reform and modernize after that?
Yeah, they did. In the mid-19th century, they started the Tanzimat reforms.
Tanzimat reforms, okay.
These were meant to modernize the Ottoman state, make the administration better, and integrate non-Muslim populations more effectively.
But
they faced a lot of resistance. These reforms didn't really succeed in reversing the empire's decline.
So while the Ottomans were dealing with all of this, across the Atlantic, a new power was emerging. The United States, how did their role change during this time?
Well, the 19th century was a time of huge change for the U.S. They had just come out of a brutal civil war, their federal government was stronger, and they were industrializing and expanding westwards at an incredible pace. By the late 1800s, the U.S. was ready to take a more active role in international affairs.
It seems like their approach to foreign policy was quite different from what we've seen in Europe.
It was. Early on, U.S. foreign policy was all about isolationism and non-intervention. George Washington's farewell address, the Monroe Doctrine in 1823.
The Monroe Doctrine. Remind me what that was again?
Basically, it told European powers to stay out of the Americas. It said the U.S. would oppose any attempts at further colonization.
So they were saying, this is our backyard, stay away.
Pretty much. But the U.S. didn't stay isolated forever.
Right. When did that change?
The shift toward a more assertive foreign policy started in the late 19th century. It was a combination of things. Their economy was booming, there was this sense of manifest destiny, and they needed new markets and resources.
So they were feeling their oats.
You could say that the Spanish-American War in 1898 was a big turning point.
What happened in the Spanish-American War?
The U.S. won, and that meant they acquired territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. That's when their overseas empire really began.
I see. So their influence was spreading.
Yes, and this expansion continued under President Theodore Roosevelt. He really believed in American power and was a major force in shaping U.S. foreign policy in the early 20th century.
Right. Roosevelt, he's famous for his big stick diplomacy.
Exactly. He believed in projecting American power on the world stage. He pushed for the construction of the Panama Canal, which made the U.S. Navy much stronger, especially in Latin America. And then there was the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
Okay, the Roosevelt corollary, what was that?
It basically said the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin American countries if they needed to maintain stability or prevent European intervention.
Wow. So the U.S. went from isolationism to, well, a global powerhouse.
Yeah, they did, and it's interesting because their trajectory kind of mirrors another rising power from this era, Japan.
Japan, they also went through a pretty incredible transformation in the late 19th century, did they? What fueled that change?
It was truly incredible. They went from a feudal society to a major industrial and military power in just a few decades. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 really kick-started this transformation.
The Meiji Restoration, so a period of huge political and social change.
Exactly. It ushered in an era of rapid modernization and westernization.
So they actively embraced Western ideas and technology.
Yes, their leadership realized that if they wanted to avoid being colonized by the West, they needed to modernize, and quickly. They reformed everything, sent students and diplomats abroad, brought foreign experts to Japan, and invested heavily in industry.
That's a pretty bold strategy. Did it work?
Oh, it definitely did. Japan's victory over China in the First Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895 showed everyone they were a force to be reckoned with. And then in the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, they defeated Russia.
They defeated Russia.
That shocked the world. It was the first time a modern Asian power had defeated a major European power.
Wow. That must have changed everything for Japan.
Absolutely. Their rapid rise to power made them a major player in the Pacific. They started to assert their dominance in East Asia. And, well, that laid the groundwork for their expansionist ambitions in the years to come.
It's fascinating to see how all these seemingly separate events are starting to connect. The decline of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of the U.S., Japan's incredible transformation, it all contributes to this shifting global landscape leading up to World War I.
You're right. As we head into the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore how all of this, along with those complex alliances and rivalries in Europe, created a situation that was just waiting to explode.
Okay, so we've talked about these shifting power dynamics, the rise and fall of empires, and all the key players shaping global politics before World War I. It's obvious the world was changing rapidly, but what was the spark, the event that actually pushed Europe and eventually the whole world into war?
Well, most people consider the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, to be that spark.
Right, the assassination. But it seems almost impossible that one event, even a political assassination, could lead to a global conflict. It's mind-boggling. Can you explain, what happened after the assassination? How did things escalate so quickly?
Sure. Austria-Hungary, they blamed Serbia for the assassination and issued a very harsh ultimatum. They demanded Serbia's cooperation in basically suppressing any anti-Austrian sentiment or activities.
So they were trying to put Serbia in its place.
Yeah, and when Serbia didn't fully meet the demands of that ultimatum, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914.
And that was it. The declaration of war set off a chain reaction across Europe.
Exactly. It's really a perfect example of how those alliances, which were meant to keep the peace, actually ended up making things worse. They created a rigid framework that forced countries to come to the aid of their allies.
So instead of preventing war, the alliances almost guaranteed it.
Pretty much. There was no room for diplomacy. Once one country declared war, everyone else was pulled in.
It's tragic, really, a system designed for peace ending up making things so much worse. So how did France and Great Britain get involved?
Well, Germany found itself facing a war on two fronts, against Russia in the east and France in the west. So they put the Schlieffen Plan into action. It was their military strategy for quickly invading France through neutral Belgium.
Belgium. But wasn't Belgium neutral?
Yes, and that's why it was such a big deal. Great Britain had promised to protect Belgium's independence. When Germany violated that neutrality, Great Britain declared war on August 4th, 1914.
Wow. So within just a few weeks, all the major powers in Europe were at war. It's crazy how fast it happened. But how did a European war become a global war?
It happened pretty quickly, actually. The colonial empires of the warring nations were drawn in, expanding the conflict beyond Europe. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, siding with Germany and Austria-Hungary.
So the Ottomans joined in too.
They did. And on the other side, Japan, who was allied with Great Britain, seized the opportunity to grab German colonies in the Pacific. The fighting spread from Europe to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia.
World War I was truly unlike any conflict the world had ever seen before. And the impact was massive.
It was devastating. Millions of people died, empires collapsed, the political map of Europe was redrawn. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war in 1919, was very harsh on Germany. It created resentment and anger that contributed to the rise of fascism and ultimately led to World War II.
It's a stark reminder that everything is connected and peace is fragile. As we wrap up our deep dive into the lead up to World War I, what are the key takeaways? What have we learned?
Well, I think we see how nationalism, imperialism, and militarism combine to create an incredibly dangerous international environment. And those alliances, which were supposed to maintain peace, actually made things worse. They took away any chance for diplomatic solutions.
Right, so a system designed to prevent war can actually make war more likely.
That's the irony of it all. And then, of course, there's the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It shows us that even seemingly isolated events can have massive global consequences.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. And the devastating results of the war teach us just how vital diplomacy, international cooperation, and peaceful conflict resolution really are.
It's been an incredible journey through such a pivotal moment in history. We've seen how decisions, both by individuals and by entire nations, shape the course of events.
Understanding this period is essential if we want to understand the 20th century and even the challenges we face today. Studying the past can give us insights into how international relations work, the root causes of conflict, and that constant search for peace.
This has been a truly fascinating and thought-provoking look at the events leading up to World War I. Thanks for listening.
It was my pleasure.